Hey, what's up, guys? And it's been a while, but we're going to be back. Joining you is going to be, well, myself, and then we're going to have Arch Warhammer and Grey Hunter. Both, if you guys haven't heard of these guys before, they have their own channels where they do Warhammer lore, and they're going to be joining us once more. We're going to be talking about the dwarfs in light of a bunch of information coming out. Still rather scant in terms of depth, but obviously it's something that they're going to be releasing in the weeks to come, so we figured we at least give you an introduction to the dwarfs themselves. So I'll let both of these guys, starting with Arch, just give a little brief introduction to themselves, and then we'll hop right into the content with an overview. So Arch?
Well, I'm Arch Warhammer. I do lore and Warhammer-related Let's Plays and such on nonsense. And Lucas?
I do stuff and things on the internet. I make videos, and sometimes they're lore videos, but most of the time they're not.
And I know in the past, Arch, you have made a dwarfs overview video, so I'll link both of these guys to check it out in more in depth. Of course, I am just here to give you the short, the long, yeah, not the long of it. We try and ignore that. The short of it is what this video is about. And I know Luke Grey Hunter is actually going to plan on making a video in the near future, right?
He says short, and he's like, you're using short in massive air quotes.
Right. Yeah, for those of you who haven't seen us just yet, yeah, the short is just a technical term we use here. Short relatively. So let's go ahead and dive into it. With an overview, I think we're just going to go over the pros and cons generally of a dwarf army, and I'm going to hand it to Arch to get us started on some of the pros.
Well, the dwarves are, in very many cases, a very standard dwarf army. If you've heard about dwarves in general fantasy, Lord of the Rings, etc., you have a general idea of how the dwarves are. They're very strong, very sturdy, very hardy folks, very hard to get running. They're tough, essentially. And in Warhammer, they're much just that. They're a very, very tough, hardy breed, living underneath the mountains and constantly fighting off orcs and marauders, chaos powers, monsters, etc. They're tough little bastards, definitely. And additionally, they've got fantastically crafted weapons and armor, making them probably and potentially one of the most durable armies in Total War Warhammer. And, well, that is their primary strength. They're very, very, very hard to deal with in straight up melee, often requiring you to exploit their maneuverability to try and get into a favorable position, using their limited maneuverability against them.
And I think we had written a couple of notes. So high toughness, great armor and defense, and then on top of that, I think Archie had mentioned previously, we have high leadership stats on these guys. So on top of just breaking individual warriors, the army as a whole is held together pretty strongly. And then on top of that, you have some of the best technology in this lore.
Oh, certainly. You've got crossbows, guns, helicopters, flame cannons, organ guns, cannons, all kinds of stuff, along with some slightly more archaic but also very solidly created stuff, like essentially your basic catapult in the form of the stone thrower or grudge thrower, because, well, they carve curses into their rocks because, it's more effective that way, as was proven during World War II. And bolt throwers.
Yeah. So we'll go over the army composition in a tad, but that's a nice preview of kind of what you're up against. And I'll pass it on to Grey Hunter, who can then touch on some of the cons of what would be a formidable force.
Cons, right, cons. See, the thing about dwarves is that on the tabletop at least, and hopefully not in Total War Warhammer, because that would just, no, please no. On the tabletop, the dwarves do not really have any cons. Their biggest con is basically that they don't move very quickly. There you go, ladies and gentlemen. The cons of dwarves. They're slow.
Yeah.
Be like,
You
because
might consider that a disadvantage, of course, because you go like, okay, the dwarves can't charge you. Well, why would they want to? They have no real incentive. They have cannons and crossbows and rifles and mortars and flame cannons. They
and
really don't really give that a shit.
add to that, this is for the tabletop specifically, of course, but added to this, they get a +1 strength bonus on the charge for the entire army. So if they happen to get into grappling range with you, they're going to hit you harder. If you get into grappling range with them and you charge them instead, they get a bonus to defending themselves because they have a shield wall. So, cons, everybody, it's pretty much they go slowly. And even if they go slowly and you catch them, they're probably going to be able to kick your ass.
Yeah, so we'll talk a bit about this in the future on how they might balance this, but I think what we got is perhaps think maybe Sparta or you have slow-moving units. They're costly. You could expose their flanks. Theoretically, that's how these guys would be balanced. We'll talk a bit about that later. Let's dive right into the typical army composition. We're going to be breaking this down apparently according to sort of how it goes in the tabletop. So we're going to look at melee, ranged, equipment, and commanders. And of the sort of basic troops, we're going to split that up into core, special, and rare. So let's go ahead and start off with the melee forces. And let's start with, okay, what are the core units? We'll hit up Arch, and then hopefully Grey Hunter, you can chime in as we move through these.
Okay, well, I'll do the core units then. Then Grey Hunter can do the specials. Then I do the rares, and we can
Yay.
kind of roll through. So, core units melee is the Dwarf Warriors, which are, well, they're Dwarf Warriors. They are the citizen militia of the Dwarf kingdoms. They are very well armed, heavy armor as standard, shields, one-handed weapons of excellent quality, very, very tough. Some of the toughest basic troops in the game at toughness 4 and leadership 9. So it requires something quite special to actually move these guys out of a position. And the second unit, melee unit, which is an upgrade to the Dwarf Warrior, is the Longbeard, which we saw in the Creative Assemblies video. Now, Longbeards are slightly more expensive than Dwarf Warriors and tabletop points costs, but they make up for it by being immune to psychology, which this essentially means you cannot scare them. If you have a fear or terror-causing units, Longbeards give absolutely no shits. And then they have giant axes, two-handed weapons, because, why not?
All right, and now we're going to move on to the special dwarf melee units.
So special units are kind of, they're a bit rarer than your regular infantry guys or your regular core troops. So you'll have fewer of them on the tabletop or on the battlefield as it will be in Total War Warhammer. But they'll still be, they're like the elite units for breaking the line or for holding it in the dwarves instance. So you've got hammers up first as kind of the guardians of a hold. They're basically, they fight with big, massive two-handed hammers. On the tabletop, these things are great weapons, so they strike last, but as the dwarves kind of like waiting for their enemy to come to them, that doesn't really matter all that much. So they're going to be kind of your go-to hold the line unit, which you'll probably plant right in the middle. The Iron Breakers are kind of a upgraded version of that. They're very similar. The Hammerers are usually more of a personal bodyguard, and the Iron Breakers are more of a specialized elite among elites. So the problem with the dwarves is that basically their entire army is elite. So using the word is kind of irrelevant a lot of the time. They've got miners as well, and when you think of miners, you're pretty much on the ball. These guys just have massive pickaxes, and they can literally mine under the enemy on the tabletop. So that should be interesting because you could potentially use them if you're facing something like the Empire and tunnel underneath the army entirely and pop out right behind the cannons and be like, surprise. Last in the list of special units that are primarily melee are Slayers. So Slayers are basically disgraced dwarves. They failed in some way, and so in penance they seek out glorious death, and they shave all of their hair off except for a brilliant, gigantic orange mohawk, and go around looking for things to die against. So you can get Slayers for pretty much every big monstrous beastie you could possibly imagine. Giants, trolls, dragon slayers. They've got everything. Pretty much special melee in a nutshell. Kill it all.
Yeah, so it's hard to imagine something worse than that, but I guess we'll move on to the rares and back to Arch then.
The rare units, well, on one hand, you've got the Rangers. Now, the Rangers used to be one of the more ridiculous units in tabletop because you could have virtually entire armies of these bastards, and they're essentially just hyped up quarrelers, which is another unit, a ranged unit. They've got crossbows and throwing axes, if for some magical reason you decide to use throwing axes instead of your giant ass crossbows, and two-handed great weapons. So they're a ranged unit that will kick the absolute snot out of practically any unit that is going to actually try and counter them. I mean, charging these bastards with light cavalry is pretty much just handing them a light snack. But they are, of course, somewhat limited in numbers, as, well, most dwarves consider any dwarf that spends too much time out over the open areas of the world under the sun to be, at the very least, a little bit cuckoo, and in most cases, dangerously unstable. So something's bloody wrong with them.
Oh, and also, they have the special rule of scouts, which means that they don't have to deploy with the rest of your army. They can just sit on the side of the enemy.
Well, obviously, I mean.
Balance, everybody! Balance!
And if you really want balance, oh, we have the unit for you, yes. The Iron Drakes. These are iron breakers, so they're clad head to toe in some of the heaviest armor in the Warhammer universe. And instead of these puny melee weapons, because who the hell likes them, they carry around giant cannons loaded with grape shot. I have seen these little bastards evaporate entire units of super heavy elite infantry just by looking at them like, oh, are those fully upgraded Coronate warriors you've got there? No longer they are not. And that's it.
It's so ridiculous. But let's move on to range thing. Range things are slightly less ridiculous. Kind of, a little bit. Actually, no, they're not. They're not even slightly. So let's start with Quarrelers, because these are your basic troops, and basic again is going to be in air quotes, massive, massive air quotes. Because these guys, they're basically just dwarf warriors, except they have the advantage of being able to shoot you first. So they have dwarf crossbows, when I can learn to speak English properly, and dwarf crossbows are armor piercing. So if you put these guys in front of something and shoot it, you're probably going to kill it, which is obviously the goal that you have there. But if somebody gets into melee range with you, you've got a hand weapon, you've got heavy armor, and you can also take shields for these guys. So you've basically got dwarf warriors, but better. And then you've got Thunderers. Thunderers are the slight upgrade to Quarrelers because Thunderers have guns. Yes, yes, they do. And again, like Quarrelers, they're basically just dwarf warriors that can shoot you. They even cost the same on the tabletop as Quarrelers do. So there's not really an advantage to either one, except that they both will kill you really, really quickly. And it kind of makes taking warriors a little bit superfluous. And if we do a bit about balance at the end of this video, Arch and I have many, many gripes about people who like to do that because they're douchebags. So most of the equipment that they have in the sense of war machines is kind of similar to the Empire, but better. So they've got cannons like the Empire do, but obviously these cannons being built and manned by dwarves are a lot better. And they can take... So just a little sideline here. The thing about dwarves with magic is they don't use magic in the same way as all of the other races do. They have runes, so they imbue items with particular magical runes that do stuff and things. Cannons can take these runes. So you thought the cannon was bad when it was just a cannon. Now it's a magical cannon. Have fun facing off against that. They have a stone thrower as well, called a grudge thrower, but a grudge thrower is a little bit special in that they inscribe their ancient grudges into the stones that these things throw. And again, they can take magic items for these war machines. So you're starting to see why people might think the dwarves are just a little bit overpowered.
Additionally, I need to cut in there. In most cases, if you actually manage to get into melee with the artillery will usually lose. Not so with dwarves, because their artillery crew members kick ass, and you can even attach special characters to the artillery crew, like the dwarf engineer, who will actually beat the shit out of most standard light cavalry units. Not to mention the bastard comes with pistols, so he might just pop a few of your guys before they even get that far.
It's true. And he can take magic items of his own. So, they heard you liked magic items, so you can have magic items on your cannons. You can have magic items on the crew. Not overpowered at all. Nope. Not even slightly.
Well, you've covered the cannons and the grudge throwers, which for special units only leaves the bolt throwers, which it's a ballista. I mean, how much do you really need to know about the ballista?
It's a magic ballista.
Oh yes, of course. It fires magical flaming ballista bolts because that shit works somehow. But if you are going to let me blabber on a bit, I would very happily like to go on with the rare units and the true bullshit of the army list.
This is why I let him do this, because it's great when he gets mad.
You see, the dwarves have access to something called an organ gun. Now, we had those in our own history. They were essentially just a ton of small cannons strapped to a rickety-ass cart, and in most cases it just, destroyed the cart, but occasionally it killed one or two Italians on the other side of a bridge or somewhere. However, in Warhammer, this thing will remove entire units of super heavy cavalry in the blink of an eye, and it's accurate to boot. And unlike the Hellblaster volley gun of the Empire, which frequently blows itself up in a spectacular explosion, this thing doesn't even do that often. And the handful of times you see your opponent roll a misfire and you go, aha, suck it. The boss goes, no, I have a rune on this that allows me to re-roll that.
Yep.
It's a horrible thing. It is. It really is. And of course, the flame cannon. The flame cannon. It's a napalm launcher, except very, very large. Imagine a flamethrower, except it's mounted on the back of a truck. This is stuff that even in World War II, we mere humans had not quite perfected. But of course, the dwarves are more than capable of using these things, and I actually used to like the flame cannon. I considered it to be one of the more okayish elements of the dwarven army, as it occasionally blew up and was somewhat unpredictable. Of course, Games Workshop decided to fix that and now made it a bit of a sniper weapon with a massive template. We do have to mention Malachi Makison's Goblin Hewer, don't we? Oh yes, we do.
I suppose so.
This one's technically not legal anymore, but considering that Games Workshop blew up their own universe, I don't really give a shit. So, it was invented by something so insane as a Slayer engineer. So, the dude has already sworn to go kill himself, but he couldn't quite, leave his hobby behind, and so he designed, amongst other things, a giant airship with cannons and stuff, because, he had free time. And he also designed the Goblin Hewer, which essentially just throws axes at incredible speeds. It's virtually a large machine gun that fires not bullets, but axes, because, well, why wouldn't you do such a thing?
And you used to be able to make those axes magical.
And this time, the crew aren't even just dwarfs, they're slayers!
Oh, God.
And everyone was happy.
Jeez.
They're special snowflakes. Well, okay. So, as we all know, Leonardo da Vinci thought to himself, it would be really cool if humans could fly, and he made a drawing of something that he thought might fly in the future. That's the gyrocopter in a nutshell. It mounts, if I recall correctly, a gun that is essentially like a mini machine gun. It's not quite as good as the Goblin Hewer, but it's very mobile. So whereas other armies like the Bretonians or the Empire have Pegasus or Griffin riding people to go around and dart after war machines and such, the dwarves have what is essentially a Huey that flies around and shoots everything,
Yeah.
and then goes, "Ha! You thought you could catch me? Nuh-uh," and then flies away again. You thought that was crazy already? No. No. You haven't encountered crazy yet. Crazy is when you go to the rare unit section and you see they have a bomber version of this. And yes, it has a special rule even called bombing run.
Oh my God.
It's going to fly in behind you and kill everything. It's also got relentless, and relentless means that it doesn't have to test its leadership if it wants to run away really, really fast in front of an enemy unit. It just goes, haha, you thought I had to test on my leadership score? No, and zips away. Only to zip back again the next turn and kill everything, because fucking dwarves.
All right. Well, I'm gonna cut you guys off from ranting anymore. Let's move on to commanders. Arch, I'll let you take this one.
Oh, commanders. Now, I'm just depressed that you didn't ask me about this the last version when Thorgrim Grudgebearer, the High King, was properly broken. I think the bastard at one point in time had about 12 wounds. Basically, in tabletop, if you want to kill something, you have to take off its wounds. Like, the vast majority of characters has one wound. Like, big things have 3 or 4, and really, really big things have, 5, maybe 6.
If they're lucky.
Thorgrim was just bigger than all of this. Additionally, he of course has ridiculous toughness, so even hurting him in the first place is virtually impossible. He is virtually immune to weapons, as he's got an automatic armor save against anything that is not, what is it, strength 6? Which is essentially giants and trolls.
Pretty much. I mean, okay, so I've got the army book actually here. So let's go through Thorgrim just so people understand how truly bad this is. Now he used to have about 12 wounds. Now he just has 7. So that's obviously
Much
a nerf.
better.
Yeah, much better, much better. He has a special rule called the High King because he's High King Thorim, Grudge Bearer. Obviously, and if he dies, if he should happen to die, which is very, very unlikely, but if it happens, all of the dwarves immediately gain the Frenzy special rule, which means not only do they hit you harder, they hit you faster. Yay. He's got this thing called the Throne of Power, which he's carried into battle on, and it adds +4 to his wounds. Now, thank God that's already included in the 7, because could you imagine if they suddenly went, no, actually, he has 11 because he's on this big shield thing. It also gives him a magical save. So if you shoot him with magic, he still gets to, be cool about it. It's great. Why are they doing this?
And his combat potential.
Oh,
You gotta
God.
remember that magical axe he has that always wounds on a 2+, regardless of enemy toughness. He could be fighting a dragon with toughness 8, and he just goes like, I don't give a shit. Whack!
Oh, but if it's a model in a magical suit of armor, he needs a 3.
Yes, it's a
So,
nerf.
big
It's a
nerf.
massive threat.
Big nerf right there.
All right, gentlemen. Next one.
But yeah, like this needs a whole video of its own, just saying about how Thorgrim Grudgebearer just needs to go die in a fire.
I come here and with the anticipation that we're going to go through a bullet points, and Grey Hunter's here. Hold on, let me refer to the freaking book. So now we have 2 lore experts reading a book to you. Okay, we could go on forever. Oh God.
We'll be good, we promise.
Plus, you have a bone to pick with the dwarfs, which doesn't make this any easier. Let's try Grey Hunter. Do you want to move on to the next commander? I'm interested in the Anvil of
Just,
Doom. I know nothing about it.
do we want to go through the rest of the special characters, or do we just want to go with general things?
Anything
We
that
should probably
you
just
think
skip
is
to
kind
the
of
generic
General
characters.
things? All right, we'll go with general things.
Because-
It'll make things easier because we won't have as much hatred to burn. So let's go with what would usually be the general. I'll leave the Anvil of Doom for Arch to explain. So generals in the dwarf army are usually either lords or thanes, and they're essentially what they say on the tin. It's a high lord. It's a guy who goes, you know what, this is my home, and I am protecting it. So they're fairly good. They're very, very good in melee. Not so great on the whole ballistic thing, although they can take pistols and handguns. So like the rest of the dwarves, they're kind of something comes towards you. It's not quite within axe whacking range. Switch and boom. Thanes are a slightly less ridiculous version of that. They're kind of they're like a second in command, basically. Except they have a special rule where they can be the battle standard bearer, so they can get a cool banner to wave around and be like, "Hey, this is the rally point. Be right here." And that's Thanes in a nutshell.
The Anvil of Doom. Well,
Tee
essentially, the Anvil of Doom is a buff to your quote-unquote a magic user, the Rune Lord. And essentially, they don't use spells, they use so-called runes, and there are too many runes for me to go through with any kind of speed here, but I think the biggest thing is it has a rune called the Oath and Steel, sorry, which gives 1+ armor save, which doesn't seem like much until you realize that every single bastard in your army has heavy armor or better, which can in some cases make your units virtually immune to normal, humans with swords and shit, requiring a giant to smack them in the face with a tree trunk to actually register on the little bastard. And if you really want to just screw with the enemy, you've already built an entire army of goddamn quarrelers, and you just figure, I really hate my opponent. I want to just last insult. You have a rune called the Rune of Wrath and Ruin that, when buffed with the Anvil of Doom, gives you 24 magic missiles that hits on 2d6 times strength 4. Now, what this means is you have a magic attack that hits the number of times as the number of eyes you roll on 2d6, so potentially 12 hits at strength 4. Basically, this unit can simulate the attack of an entire unit of dwarf warriors every single goddamn turn. Not to mention the fact that, well, if you thought you could go like, well, I'll just neutralize this with light cavalry, you haven't been paying attention. As it, of course, has a massive bodyguard of elite dwarves with a dwarf hero on top of it with a massive hammer. So, yeah, good luck with that.
And if you think you're just going to take it out from range with magic missiles, nah, because it has a magic ward save as well. Because it's not overpowered at all. This is the dwarf version of magic, by the way. They don't get to have magic in the sense the Empire does, and this. So, just to clear that up. They have ridiculously overpowered runes and such, but they won't be using them in conjunction with calling comets from the sky. So, rest assured. They're not quite that overpowered.
Small mercies.
All right, well,
Just a bit.
we can use that as a segue. So I think we've pretty much covered most of the dwarfs, and you can see kind of oozing out of that discussion balance issues, which I guess we'll move into now.